If I did cold openings, that would be my cold opening. What you just did. And I've actually been considering switching to cold openings because I kind of like that. Hey there, welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, where we're expanding the natural family planning conversation. I'm your host, Ellen Holloway. Welcome back to the podcast. We are here with Kathleen for another NFP in real life episode. How's it going, Kathleen?
Oh, we're going.
We were discussing our various sleepless nights last night. So hopefully we're able to articulate well enough in this episode.
Fingers crossed. If we can't, then just know it's a lack of sleep and nothing else.
Yes.
We're not dumb. We just don't sleep.
But luckily for this particular episode, we are pulling from a book that we both of us are sitting with this book open on our desks. So if we start losing words, we can just read from the book, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just like we do with the catechism a lot. We just kind of like read.
Exactly. Anyway, so this episode, I'm excited to talk about this episode. We are going to be discussing sex and arousal during the different phases of the women's cycle. The book that we are pulling a lot of this info from, we're going to be pulling some info from this book and then also just like personal experience. But the book is Holy Sex. I've talked about it like a million times. I feel like I love this book. I think you should all buy it.
Yeah.
It's by Dr. Gregory Popcak. It's an incredible resource. Kathleen and I were talking before we pressed record that both of us had, when we read the book for the first time, we were both in very different mindsets with NFP and sex. And we both agreed that we felt very seen and heard by this book when we read it. Like
100%.
There's so much in it. And Dr. Gregory Popcak does such a good job crossing the whole spectrum of opinions about sex and just the mindsets that we have around sex. And then he has a very practical section toward the end, which you're not supposed to read until you've read the beginning of the book, which I totally appreciate. He says it in the book.
He does.
If
he
you're
warns
skipping
you.
ahead to here, go back, start at page 1.
You're going to explode if you skip ahead.
Yep.
It's like...
But he's got a really practical section at the end. He calls it the anatomy of infallible loving. And I love it. And so, and one of the sections that he has, just such a good point, is basically lovemaking during the different phases. So we're going to go through phase 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to talk about those things. And just as a quick refresher, if you're new, to, the fertility cycle, phase 1 is going to be pre-ovulation. It's basically menstruation, is phase 1. I mean, there's menstruation plus a couple of days.
Yeah. Depending on your cycle,
right? It might just be menstruation for you. It might be menstruation plus a few days. Phase 2 is going to be your gearing up for ovulation phase. This is going to be your high energy phase. This is going to be lots of cervical mucus, somewhere around 10-ish days, maybe on average, of this kind of exciting gearing up for ovulation phase. And then phase 3 is going to be your post-ovulatory phase. You have ovulated. You are no longer fertile for the rest of your cycle. And that's maybe 10 to 14 days. So those are what the phases are. So let's start at phase 1.
Let's do it. Phase 1. So, this is such a good, I'm like reading through it as you're like talking. I'm just like, wow. Like I said to Ellen that I read this book, a couple of years ago now, and I really just need to go back and read it all because it's like, wow, I forgot this was in here and it's all so good.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think the beautiful part about like this in particular about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 is that like, it doesn't, just like, we're not just talking about like, NFP, like, being practiced just for the sake of avoiding or achieving pregnancy, but we're talking about it in regards to how to best use it, how to use it to make your sex life the best it can be, which is really cool. So yeah, he starts talking about in phase one, that a woman will probably feel the most tender and sensitive during phase one of her cycle. So what does that mean, right? Like in regards to your sex life and how you proceed with it. That you need to be aware of the husband should be aware of the sensitivities in his wife's body. The wife should be aware of the different sensations she feels during phase one. And then that communication that can open up from that regarding, okay, yeah, not this time around. Like, this doesn't feel good right now. It'll feel good later on, but like, it doesn't feel good now.
Right. Right.
It's like, I don't know. It's so cool how our bodies sort of operate like this. You know what I mean?
Right. And it requires communication. The things that we're going to be talking about really require communication. Like, and specifically in phase one, the woman's genitals, the woman's genitals and her breasts are going to be more tender. Yeah. So that is something that needs to, husbands, be aware of that. Ask your wife. The majority of our listeners are women. So women, you need to tell your husband about this. Right. If you don't like your breasts being touched, if you don't ever like it, make sure you tell that, right? If you don't like your breasts being touched during this time, communicate it. Right. If anything's uncomfortable, you need to say, hey, no, not right now. Like that, it just doesn't feel good, because the whole point of having sex is, this self gift, right? Your goal is to make your spouse have a great time. And his goal is to make you have a good time. Right. Well, I mean, among other things, but like, like one of your main primary goals is to give your spouse pleasure at this point. Right. It's not about your pleasure, but it's important to communicate to your spouse, hey, this is not pleasurable right now. This is pleasurable right now. And it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to say these things. But it is, you're right. It's like, it's so important, because you're right. It's not about, like, your concern is not your pleasure. Your concern is your spouse's pleasure. Right. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, sort of the same thing, because even though my pleasure is not my concern, I know it is his concern. And so you're not saying it as a, hey, do this better. You're saying it so that they can love you the best way they can love you. Right. Exactly. Yes. That's such a good point. And I think something else that's really important to mention about phase one, which is most of phase one is going to be menstruation. There is nothing barring Catholics from having sex during menstruation. There is absolutely nothing wrong with it. Orthodox Jews do practice abstaining during menstruation because of ritual impurity. That's in the Bible, blah, blah, blah. We're past ritual impurity. That was the something that was, that was established before, like these were steps that God made for his people. And he said, okay, let's take step one and let's just get you a little holier. And then let's take step two. Like you think about Jesus, and he was like, and this is like totally unrelated from having sex during menstruation, but Jesus said, hey, I know Moses told you that you could divorce, but that's not the standard I'm holding you to anymore. Right. Yeah. Like when Jesus came, he held us to a new standard. And so certain things were dropped away from the rules of Leviticus. Right. Because they were stepping stones for our, ascension toward God. Right. Right. And so that is not something that we practice anymore. Now, if that's something you're uncomfortable with, you don't have to have sex during this time. That's okay. Yes, it is messy. Yes, it might be a little bit different. Yes, the woman's body is going to be a lot more tender. And so penetration, like deep penetration, might not be a great option during this phase, meaning like man on top positions might not be the best for this. Like, it might be better to do woman on top positions where the woman can really control the level of penetration, or like sitting up positions where you're like facing each other. And so there's a lot more control of like penetration depth.
Yeah.
Like control from the woman, right? Because of the tenderness that's going on there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, the fact that we can like even be aware of this stuff is just so cool to me, you know, that
I know, right?
It is. It's just, we can be aware. I mean, yeah, it's like it just makes it so clear, so insanely clear that God has a design for human sexuality, and that pleasure is a huge part of that design.
Yeah.
That we're not always systematic, right? But like, hopefully, ideally, we're more systematic than we give ourselves credit for, right? We're like, oh, women, they're hormonal and erratic and all over the place, up and down. But really, it's like, if we break it up into the phases and we do see this, and we can see that, no, yeah, we're more systematic and understandable than any of us even realize.
Right.
And that's according to the design.
I think this conversation that we're having about kind of the pleasure, the woman's pleasure during these different phases, this might be really important to like share this episode with your husband if you're like not sure how to bridge the conversation, because I think a lot of husbands can feel, and I pulled this from a little earlier section in this same book, in Holy Sex, is that husbands can feel like pleasuring their wife is like trying to hit a moving target. And it is a moving target. Okay. And let me explain why it is physically a moving target. The woman's anatomy is physically moving throughout the cycle. The cervix is moving up and down. It is getting softer. It is getting more open. Then it is closing. It is getting harder. Just because the cervix is the only thing that we can like externally, well, I guess internally, like recognize and chart, just because that's the only thing that we can like notice by examining ourselves, that doesn't mean it's the only thing that's moving. Because
from what I understand, there's a lot of things down there. So if one thing moves, it's likely that other things are moving too.
It's likely that other things are moving, right? And so the things that pleasure us during one phase might be the exact opposite of pleasure during another phase. For example, if I'm realizing now we should probably mark this episode as explicit, because like,
maybe
we're getting a little bit into it, which is great, which is so great. For example, if as a woman, if you really like, I just threw my pen, I got so excited about this. If you really like your husband touching your labia and moving around in that area and things like that during, say, phase 2 or phase 3, you might not like that during phase 1 because there's a lot more tenderness going on. Or maybe you like it, but just at a different level, at a different speed, at a different amount of pressure, at, whatever that is. And that's just one example of something. If you like having your breasts touched during phase 2 and phase 3, maybe you just like can't stand it during phase 1. I think the breast thing can also like when you get pregnant, like it'd be like, oh, don't you dare touch my breast.
Although it also depends on where you are in your pregnancy sometimes too.
That's true.
Like, even that is but again, everything's moving, everything's changing constantly.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, basically I wanted to say that to kind of affirm any men who are listening to any husbands who are listening to this, of like, if it feels like you are trying to shoot and hit a moving target, it's because you are. But I say that with this caveat that it's essentially moving in the same rhythm.
Yes, exactly.
Every cycle. And so while it might not be exactly the same, we're not machines.
Right.
Once you can kind of get to know the rhythm, you might have a better time of it.
Yeah. That's exactly
One more
right.
thing to say on phase 1, and then we should definitely move on. Because I don't want to cut out the other 2 phases too short. If I personally, this is a personal story. Before I got married, I had never thought about having sex during menstruation. Like I was like, it had never crossed my mind.
Right.
And I was having lunch with some coworkers, and I don't know why we were talking about sex. But I was extremely uncomfortable and blushing the entire time they were having this conversation, because that's where I was at with sex. And they were talking about having sex during menstruation, and they were like, do you do it? And one woman's like, nope, never, not. And then another one was like, just put a towel down. It's fine. and that just shows the range, and it's okay. It's okay. Like, and that woman who said, just put a towel down, it's fine. She's like, I find it's most pleasurable. Like I love having sex during menstruation, because it just feels the best during, right?
Yeah.
So just know that wherever you lie in that spectrum of comfortability with it, that's completely normal, and that's okay. And if you change, maybe you listen to this episode and you're like,
maybe I'll give that a shot.
Maybe it's worth giving it a shot, right? That's great.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. We aren't machines, right? It's like different strokes for different folks, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah. And also like we're talking about 2 people here, right? So, I mean, both really need to be comfortable with it. Maybe one of you is up to it, and maybe the other one's kind of like, I'm not really feeling that right now, and that needs to be respected too, so, but like sex in and of itself is very vulnerable. It's a vulnerable situation, right? And that kind of like adds a layer of vulnerability to it.
Right. I mean, because you're bleeding, right? Like
exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, nobody should feel one way or the other about being open to it or not being open to it. It's okay. Either way, wherever you fall on that spectrum.
Either way.
Yeah.
Okay. Phase 2. I feel like this is the most elusive phase, because most of the time, if you're trying to avoid, you don't get to have sex.
No, it's the most frustrating thing. It's so funny. And I was thinking about this as we were preparing for this, is that my one friend and I have talked in the past, and she always says that when she dies and goes to heaven, if she dies and goes to heaven, no, I'm just kidding. She's going to heaven. She's a saint. But when she dies and goes to heaven, her first question for God is why? Why did you design us this way, that when we want it most, it's like off the table, right? And of course.
Can I answer that question in one?
I was going to say
one answer. I have one possible answer, and it's this: that God loves creation. He loves to bring children into this world. He loves to create life. He loves that he gave us that ability.
Yeah.
And so, God wants you to have babies.
It's like,
surprise.
He literally wrote it into your body.
He did.
Yeah.
He wants you, right? And yet I do not discount the fact that it is extremely frustrating. And we're going to talk about phase 3 in a minute, about how frustrating that drop of hormones can be. I do not discount the fact that it's frustrating. I fully agree that it is frustrating. But it's because God wants us to have kids.
Yeah.
He really, really does.
You are not wrong.
I mean, gosh, heaven celebrates conception, right? Like a life is conceived, and heaven is just dancing and singing and praising. And everyone in heaven can't wait for that life that you conceived to make it to heaven, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my answer. That's my answer to that question. It doesn't make it any easier.
Well, and that's exactly it. And I think that's the thing that we end up lamenting together the most, is just like, here I am, phase 2 she's got 5 kids in tow. I'm about to have 5 kids in tow, and it's like, And yeah, like we need a break. So, but the frustration that can come from abstaining during phase 2, because let's talk about phase 2, right? Phase 2, you have that massive increase in hormones.
Yeah.
Which,
women are much more easily aroused at this time. Now, this is not to say, men, you are listening, just because the woman is more easily aroused does not mean you get to skip foreplay for this phase.
No. Oh, no,
it does not equate to the arousal curve of men. The arousal curve of women is different still.
Yes.
Even though it is shorter now, it's faster, it's quicker, and maybe even spikes higher.
Mm-hmm.
The area of the women's genitals, my goodness, this word is like not.
Yeah, you're struggling with that word today.
The area of the woman's genitals needs to be warmed up. And that doesn't mean it needs to be physically touched in order to be warmed up. Some women, benefit from that. But like blood needs to flow to that area, and foreplay, helps that blood flow. So,
well, and let's talk too about foreplay, just like we're talking about everything's kind of different phase by phase. Foreplay in and of itself, is probably going to be different phase by phase.
Right. And this phase of phase 2 is like, the woman's going to have the most energy during this phase, which that might lead to more willingness to be creative, more willingness to try new things. If there's a position that you've kind of thought about trying, not so sure, this is a grethis phase to try that position in. Like, if you're having sex during this phase, right?
Yeah.
This is a great phase for that. Because like the woman's body is more open, like biologically, it makes sense that the woman's body would be more open to receiving sperm at this time. Right. And so that kind of just flows right into like the woman would be more open to receiving her husband in a new way, in a new position, something like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would even, I feel like we could talk like more about phase 2, but it is sort of like, it's one that needs probably the least conversation, because
probably I think we could go ahead and move on to phase 3. Yeah. Okay.
Phase 3.
So again, this phase can be so frustrating.
It's like the worst,
because
sometimes
we as women, we just came from high general arousal.
Yep.
To a huge drop in hormones. Like you look at the map, or the graph, and it looks like a roller coaster.
Yeah.
And this is the big drop, right? Luteinizing hormone and estrogen both drop quickly within just a couple. Luteinizing hormone within a couple of hours, estrogen within a couple of days. And it's a very quick drop off. And so that drop can lead to lower energy levels, first off, which just is overall going to make you want to just curl up and go to bed instead of love your spouse.
Yeah.
But, and there's also like, there's just this buildup to hormones, and then all of a sudden all gone. But I'm going to read a couple of sentences from the book, which I read over them again this morning before we recorded. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I needed to hear this again.
You were seen.
I was seen. I was really seen. Actually, I was called out, I think, a little bit.
There you go.
Less seen, seen and called out. Okay. Note that relying on physiological arousal alone to be the catalyst for sexual intimacy is an all too common mistake that can doom lovemaking. Lesser lovers think of sex as scratching an itch. If they don't feel aroused, then they aren't in the mood and they tend to be disinclined to make love. Not being aroused is not an excuse for not loving your spouse.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, I am not promoting requiring your spouse to have sex here. I am not at all. No, that is rape. Okay.
Yeah.
If you are being forced to have sex, that is rape. That is not what I am promoting.
Yeah.
What I am saying is, in some sense, we have, in a lot of senses, we have a duty to have sex with our spouse. That is how we renew our marital vows. It is imperative to our marriage that we have sex.
Mm-hmm.
So, women, just because you don't want to doesn't mean you don't get to.
Yes. No, that's so true. At the same
time, again, I am not promoting being forced into sex when you are not there yet. And that is okay. It is okay to tell your spouse no, but you need to look at yourself and say, am I saying no right now because I really just need the rest? Is there a reason I'm saying no? Or am I just saying no right now because I don't really feel in the mood?
Yeah.
If that's the only reason, then I want you to look at that. I want you to really dig into that, of why it is that not being in the mood means for you not having sex.
Yeah. Well, and I'll even, I would love to continue a few, into the next paragraph of that same page. He says, lesser lovers, and throughout the book, he's constantly referring to lesser lovers and infallible lovers. And I don't know, I just love that distinction.
I love that.
So infallible lovers, however, know that arousal is a less important driver of sexual intercourse than intimacy.
Yes.
Arousal, being primarily a physiological phenomenon, is susceptible to physiological factors like exhaustion, stress, illness, and even accommodation, getting used to somebody. Because of this, infallible lovers know that while arousal itself is desirable,
there's nothing wrong with arousal.
Nothing at all. It is intimacy that will propel a couple to seek the comfort of each other's arms, even when they are tired, stressed, sick, or frazzled. And I love that.
I love that. I think that's such a great example, explanation of kind of what I was trying to get across when I was yelling.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. Is that we feel, and I listen, I'm not telling anyone how to go ahead about your phase 3, because I've struggled with phase 3 a lot. And I mean, I don't right now because I don't have phases right now. I'm just pregnant, but
I know before we recorded, because I'm postpartum right now. My cycle hasn't returned and Kathleen is pregnant right now. And I was texting her and I was like, should we wait to do this episode until we're less removed from the situation? And then I was like, no, that's dumb, because who knows when that's going to to be.
Yeah. Number
who knows
one,
when my cycle is going to return. And then Kathleen's going to have postpartum after this.
And number two, it's serving as a good reminder for when we are right back there. We're back in our phases. Okay. Here's what we can sort of apply. But I've long struggled with phase 3, and I will continue to struggle with it when I have my phase 3 back again. But I think it is just such a good reminder that when we are feeling that frustration, it's because we're looking for the arousal. Mm-hmm. And the arousal it's fleeting, it's sort of like the feeling we talk about being in love, falling in love, and the feeling of being in love, right? That is fleeting. That doesn't last, right?
That's a really good comparison.
Yeah.
Of the feeling in love versus choosing to love.
Exactly.
And then the fleeting feeling of arousal versus choosing intimacy.
Exactly.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So we just, I don't want to go over time too much. We're already at the 30-minute mark.
We ramble.
So let's talk about some mechanics of this phase. The woman's body, because the cervical mucus is drying up. Mm-hmm. things don't just dry up in the body without other things drying up in the body. Like your body is drier during phase 3. That's just how it works. That's why if you take decongestants, you don't have very much cervical mucus. Like if you dry up the body, you dry up cervical mucus. If cervical mucus is drying up, your body is drying up. That means you're not going to have as much arousal fluid. So lube is a really great choice during this time. As Catholics, we can choose whatever kind of lube because we're not worrying about contraception working or not working. Right. I highly suggest almond or jojoba oil if you like jojoba oil. Yeah. Those two oils are most closely balanced to the pH of your vagina. So those are great oils to use.
Interesting.
Almond oil being the, Walmart version, right? And jojoba oil being the Whole Foods version. Meaning jojoba is much more expensive than almond oil.
I've never even heard of jojoba. I don't know what a jojoba is.
If you're in California, you can get jojoba oil at Trader Joe's. Otherwise, I don't really know where to find jojoba oil. But those two oils are most closely balanced to your pH, which means that they have the least chance of causing yeast infections. The reason why I never suggest coconut oil is because it has a very high sugar content, and coconut oil can lead to yeast infections. So I don't suggest that because it has such a high sugar content. Also, sorry, with almond oil, sweet almond oil is what you're looking for, not bitter almond oil. I know
There's
a lot about oils. There is a difference.
I'm taking notes now.
Sweet almond oil is really easy to find. Amazon, you can find it. So those are great oils to use. You can also use a water-based lube, if that's preferable to you. And basically take the lube. I'm going to get a little bit specific here, right? Take the lube, put it all over the woman's areas and all over the man's areas. It's not a one and done. Like both sides need to be well lubricated. And that will just lead to a much easier penetration. And then also on mechanics, again, going back to what we talked about in phase 1, with the positioning, phase 3 might also be a better time to do like woman on top positions or facing each other positions, sitting up or lying down, because then the woman can better control the level of penetration, because the cervix has dropped at this point. And I mean, technically speaking, there's a little bit less room, right? And that's okay. And if that's affecting you, then think about these things. We're saying all these things to think about. Bring them into conversation with your spouse.
Yeah, but basically, I think, in summary, that phase 1 and phase 3 are going to basically have very similar approaches. I think you might have less sensitivity in phase 3.
Yes, I would say less, and I would say like less overall sensitivity. Like foreplay is really, really important in phase 3, and it might take a longer amount of time. And like, let's talk about foreplay. Foreplay is not 5 minutes long, folks. Like, I'm thinking like probably average is maybe like a half hour.
Yeah.
And it could be anywhere up to an hour, or longer. Like, foreplay for as long as you want to. Just as remember the most important part is that the man needs to climax inside of the woman. That is what has to happen. When the woman climaxes, that can be before, that can be after, that can be during. That's not as important timing wise as the man's climax.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. But I mean, so basically phase 1 and phase 3 are going to be very similar, minus maybe some sensitivities. Phase 2 is just it's probably a lot faster. Everything just goes a lot faster.
Probably.
And phase 1 and phase 3, you just need to allow yourself to ease into things. Now, some people might be like me, where if you feel like it's taking you too long to sort of like get into it, you start getting inside your own head, and then you start feeling bad for your husband, and you're like, and then that like messes up the whole thing. Right. And then you're back to the beginning.
Yes.
But I mean,
I feel very seen and heard right now.
Yeah, exactly. I'm all about seeing and hearing everyone. But I mean, I think it's really important to also recognize that what I have learned is that my husband's like, we could take hours doing this and I am more than happy. So I think we kind of get into our own heads of kind of feeling really bad. Like, oh, like, I feel like I'm not, but that's not what it's about. It's about kind of being together. And again, like your husband's like, not going to care that it takes an hour, maybe more, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, your foreplay may have to change a little bit. Correct. If it's taking a long time, and it may need to kind of put the spotlight on you and less touching of him, maybe, depending on what's going on. And this is why communication is key here. It is so important.
Yeah, no. And I think that's a good place to wrap it up. But I think if anyone, really read this book, it's on page,
it's so good. The link to it will be in,
in the show notes. Yeah.
And, this is, you were about to say the page. So yes, we totally read the whole thing, but we will allow you to read, right?
We give you permission.
We give you permission to read pages 240 to 243. No further than 243. Don't you dare go to the next page until you've read the whole book.
Until you've gone back and read from the beginning. But because it is so important that, I mean, we can really, like I said before, begin to understand our body in a systematic way and how it works. And what's going to happen, what's going to be the fruit of that is just a more confident and particularly just a better sex life. Yes. And experience with your husband and becoming infallible lovers, as Dr. Popchak.
I love it. I love it.
I know. I love it too. That
totally was fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for sharing some of your experiences and stuff like that. If you're not following us on Instagram, check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. If you have questions about this stuff, guys, I do coaching. If this is the kind of stuff, if you've got a question about it, if you're frustrated with this phase 3 situation, if you're trying to figure out what's listed and not, or if we mentioned all these positions and you're like, hold on, there's something more than missionary.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Please come book an appointment with me. I want to chat with you about this. I want to help you work through this. Links to that are in the show notes. But awesome. If you have questions, reach out to us, Instagram or email. And until next time.
See you guys.